Welcome back to Thompsin and Other Disappointments, your twice-weekly cannonball dive bomb into the worlds of politics and dystopia and, well, all things shit, really, but desperately, sometimes earnestly, depressively, endlessly trying to find the funny in it. And if we can't find some doom lols, some gallows humour in there, well, then we're really fucked. That means we've reached the end of the road, guys, if that happens. That is the bell toll for the end. If you turn on this podcast, where you normally come to for a sort of, well, we're all fucked, but, you know, take a seat round the dumpster fire, I'll pass you the homebrew, and let's try and laugh about this. If you come here for that, which is basically the show's USP, and what you get is just, you know, a jokeless me trembling in silence, well, then you know that the game is really up. Curtains down. Joining me tonight, super psyched to have this guest on. Our paths crossed in a mutual campaign group in which we chat and exchange ideas. And I'm familiar with her work contributing on LBC and Byline TV, among other places. Tonight, we're going to be discussing the NHS, privatisation, funding, how bad things have gotten, and where things are headed. Please welcome to the show, Dr. Julia Patterson. Woo!
Thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. Good evening, Doctor. How are you?
I was about to say I'm very well.
Second guessing yourself already.
It's a confusing time, isn't it? We were just having a chat before, weren't we, about how it's very strange at the moment. Everything's absolutely terrible. And yet it's hard to know how long this is going to go on for. And
right.
if we're maybe coming to a turning point.
Yeah, it feels like, yeah, as we were saying a second ago, it feels like half like we are really circling the drain, like things could get really, really bad at this point. And yet at the same time, Labour conference, lots of exciting policies. Labour, I think it was yesterday, 17 points ahead in the polls. So we might be turning a corner, dare I say. Like, is it, should we have hope and faith at this moment? I don't know.
It's hard to know how far we are out from an election, isn't it? And what the government are going to do between now and then.
It's also
surprising how they've seemed to have done absolutely everything to make things bad for voters, just within a matter of weeks.
Yeah, it's like I always feel like when we're this far away from an election, also that you should never sort of underestimate the damage that like the journo-political landscape could inflict upon that 17-point lead between now and then. Like the amount of nonsense and misinformation and outright lying that they can just throw at the electorate. I wouldn't be surprised if it did come down quite dramatically, but I cling on to the hope that we could just sort of, you know, edge it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a funny one, isn't it? Because coming into this winter, I can't imagine things are going to get any better for the next 6 months for the population. And clearly the government are going to have to do an election sometime in the next sort of just under 2 years. So they're going to have to pick a moment to do it, aren't they? I mean, you know, yeah.
They could always try to win the public over with a series of tax cuts.
Exactly. It's difficult to know who the voter base is, quite honestly, that they think that's going to appeal to. And then there was that announcement today, wasn't there, about pensions that looked like pensions were going to collapse. It's like,
yeah. Did you see the thing? There's a numbers guy who does like an analysis for Sky News. I think his name's Ed Conway, and he said that his intel was telling him that we were a matter of hours away from huge chunks of the pension sector going under.
Yeah, I saw that as well. It's terrifying. I mean, it's obviously absolutely terrifying for anyone on a pension, but also politically, surely the only people that the Tories are still appealing to are that older crowd. And I mean, that's going to, you know, not be appealing, is it, even to their core voting demographic? Yeah,
but then like another underestimation is sort of, like, never underestimate how sort of, well, you're a psychiatrist by trade, right? I've got to be careful if I call people lunatics. Never underestimate how incompetent, let's say, they can be. I mean, like Theresa May wheeled out that social care policy to pay for social care by, was it like the dementia tax she was saying?
Yeah.
Ferociously unpopular with their core demographic of voter. How they didn't see that coming and the subsequent U-turn that it was going to need is beyond me. But
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think you're right. It is really, really unpredictable, particularly at the moment, because things seem to be happening so quickly.
Mm.
Um, if an election was called, who knows what kind of tactics would be at play? I mean, it was bad enough in the last general election, and I hate to say it, but I think the arena of how people behave on social media and the tactics being used by politicians have not improved since then, have they? So it's quite, I mean, it's fascinating, but in a slightly terrifying way, I think, to know what's going to
Yeah.
happen.
I look over, like I look at America and how far the political discourse has sunk. And I look at Donald Trump in particular. And as I was tweeting about him earlier in the week, saying basically he's backed into a corner at this stage where he's no longer this symbol of like aspirational wealth. He's not the billionaire that everybody thought he was. So he doesn't tick that box for the Republicans. He's not a candidate for law and order because he's a just habitual lawbreaker. I mean, how many cases has he got being thrown at him at once now? So the only thing he really has left when he's backed into this corner is either just outright corruption along the lines of sort of trying to steal elections and throwing accusations of election rigging at other people, or indeed rebranding himself as Jesus, which is...
Yeah, I mean, I've been listening probably listening to the same sort of stuff actually, but I was listening to a podcast the other day about him and how, strangely enough, the things that he was talking about 5 or 6 years ago, which received a lot of sort of consternation, a lot of sort of poo-pooing about we shouldn't listen to experts and we shouldn't trust the media and we shouldn't trust anybody and we should be individualistic about everything. Those ideas have become more powerful, haven't they? So even though you're right, he's absolutely lost his standing in terms of being a successful businessman and the American dream, for some people who are, I guess, feeling belittled, isolated, like they've been let down, he tapped into a sort of anger, which I think resonates horribly with quite a lot of people, probably more so now than it did in 2016.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the thing that he taps into, and that Johnson probably to a lesser extent tapped into, maybe around the Red Wall kind of arena, was this sort of post-industrial anger, this feeling of being left behind, while city slickers, if you like, or New Yorkers, or well, I guess, yeah, here it would be like the metropolitan elite or whatever, continue to benefit from things like EU migration. Over there, it's sort of Rust Belt, isn't it? And I think in a similar way with Johnson and Trump, what they offer these people is a quote unquote a sort of simple story of like, these people are bad because they take something from you or took something from you, and you are oppressed, you've been persecuted, and don't worry, I'm here, I'm on your side, and I'm looking out for you, wink wink, just keep voting for me, keep donating,
Yeah, it's scary.
Yeah.
It's scary. And it's difficult to know how that's going to play out in the UK, isn't it? Because you're right, Boris Johnson definitely tapped into something similar. He's gone now. I think Liz Truss is something of an enigma in terms of what she would bring out in voters.
Yeah, I think so. Femi was on the show last week, and he was saying he wasn't totally sure right now, what he didn't articulate it like this because he's much more articulate than I, but it was like he didn't know what her vibe was, whereas people who have come before her, both in the UK and over in the US, they have a sort of, a character, or they have charisma, or they have a certain vibe to them. With her, it's sort of absent. She's like this sort of, I don't know, ghost of Thatcher, but I don't know, I can't articulate it. It's but it's impossible to really pinpoint her down in any real sense, because each one of her policies and each one of her like juncture points that she's been on throughout her career have always been so changeable,
That almost makes it more scary, because there's definitely a sense that she's a vehicle for other people's ideas. And the fact that she's sort of unknowable, unreadable, we don't really know what to expect, means that we're not going to know what the next policy is going to be. And people who are unknowable in that way, it's easy to sort of use them as a blank canvas, and people project what they want to see upon, that person. And so if she is supported by a sort of, supportive media and some really strong campaign messaging, we might find that she looks like quite an attractive candidate, regardless of the fact that she herself isn't really emanating much in a way of strong ideas. I don't know. I mean,
yeah, I've not really considered that. It's an interesting angle that she's effectively a sort of mannequin that you can dress as you see fit, and then she becomes that figure, that symbol. So the Thatcherites will see her as a sort of, a Thatcher 2.0. The more centrist Tories, of which there are still, I don't know, a couple dotted around, will see her recent announcements about maybe bringing in more immigrants to bolster the labour force, to inspire growth. They will see that as her being, quite sort of centre-right, being arguably, depending on where she gets the immigrants from, quite sort of pro-Europe,
Yeah, I think we'll see. And there was obviously a lot of discussion a few years ago in the US about Hillary Clinton and the likability or not of women and how different politicians, female politicians have to behave. I think it'll be interesting to see how she's framed as a politician for that reason, because this conversation sort of has fallen out of the public domain a little bit. But when Theresa May was in charge, she definitely wasn't full of charisma. But there was argument to say that perhaps because she was a woman, we expected more warmth from her, or we expected something different from her. And there's not been much discussion about that with Liz Truss yet. But like you say, I haven't seen a great deal of charisma or warmth or anything really.
Yeah, it's always a sort of bugbear of mine, and I always shit my pants that I'm going to word this in the wrong way and it's going to come out really clumsy, which I'm sure it will do. But I always feel like when we get a woman in a position of power and influence, whether it is a commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, or it's a Theresa May, or it's a Priti Patel, somebody, I mean, look, a lot of these seem to sit further right on the political landscape, but I'm sure it could be true on the left also. It's like we sort of put this woman in a position of power and influence and then give ourselves a pat on the back for giving the job to a woman. Then we've ticked that box. But actually the woman who has been given the job has been given that job by a bunch of men who have sought out their own attributes within her. And so then this woman who gets the job tends to be, let's say, quote unquote, like a real ballbuster, or, she'll really bang heads together, or, these sort of masculine take charge, take control, she won't take any shit, all of that stuff, rather than the other attributes that we tend to celebrate within women, analysis, care, like it always seems to be, we've given the role to a woman, aren't we so great? It was like, well, hang on a second, have you what problem are you solving if you've just given it to somebody who still behaves exactly like you? Do you know what I mean? Am I making sense?
Yeah. No, I think it's really interesting, and I think this needs to be spoken about a lot more. I often think about it in terms of the Paw Patrol, because I've got 2 kids.
Right.
So a lot of other children's programs, there's this sense that you have a load of action heroes within a children's program. There's normally 4 or 5. All of them are male, apart from one, which is a female, and the female one wears the pink outfit, right? And whatever the program is, Paw Patrol, I guess, is like the classic. They've tried to introduce more female characters, but the original lineup, there was only one. There's the kind of the one who's the digger, and the one who's the brave one, and the one who's a bit of a class clown type of a character. So all of the male ones have some kind of a persona. And the girl just is the girl, like that. She's the girl one, and her, her character is being a girl.
Yeah.
So she have a defining quality beyond she wears pink and she's the girl in the pack, right? And I think that sometimes happens in other situations, and you get this strange dichotomy, don't you? Where you're right, it's like women within politics, I think, still operating in a largely male environment, and either has to behave like this sort of 80s caricature of what a woman in the workplace is, or the absolute opposite, which is sort of has to pretend to assume all of these super feminine traits. It's like, don't worry guys, there's a nice friendly lady here, that kind of, it's like really great.
Or like was it 30 Rock, or was it something else that there's a scene where the lead female character like gets a job within this male dominated team, and then sort of feels pressured to then be like, oh, look, yes, there's a chick in the team now, but don't worry, boys, I'm still one of the lads. It's like that kind of vibe. I can come to the strip club too, though, because I'm just like, But yeah, so I mean, look, I could talk about this stuff for hours, but the reason I wanted to get you on tonight was to get your intel, your experience on the NHS, where we are with it, how bad things have gotten. I guess a good point to start, really. Like, obviously, I'm familiar with your work contributing to the media outlets I mentioned at the beginning. Others may not be so familiar with you. Perhaps you could give us a little bit of background in terms of what you were doing before you were doing the campaigning and how you came to move more into sort of an activist sphere.
Sure. So my background is as a doctor. So I qualified as a doctor in 2010 and did lots of jobs that you do when you're a junior doctor, going around all the different specialties and getting experience in different areas. And I decided to specialise in psychiatry. So I started my specialty training, and which consists of 6 years of training to become a consultant psychiatrist. Sat my postgraduate exams and was really enjoying the job. I was working in London. It was really pressured but extremely interesting, working with really diverse population. And around sort of 2015, 2016, the junior doctors were in a contract dispute with the government. And it was really the first time that I think a lot of us had paid attention to the government's ability to frame issues in a way that misrepresented them.
Right.
So that's it.
This was in Jeremy Hunt's tenure, wasn't it?
Yeah. So there's a generation of doctors of about my age, so I'm in my mid-30s, who probably weren't particularly political before that happened. And what did happen was Jeremy Hunt sort of managed to impose an unfair contract on junior doctors, which disproportionately impacts on lone parents, who are mostly women in the medical profession. And he got away with it by sort of blaming us for patient safety problems within the NHS.
Right.
It came about because there was an absolute barrage of abuse towards junior doctors, which was really unpleasant to tolerate when you were working in a service. The government are doing something quite similar now to the GPs, so I have a lot of sympathy for what they're going through. But it was really awful. And
sorry, just to sort of join the dots to colour this in a little bit. So the challenges that you were up against in that environment were off the back of like lack of funding, lack of resourcing.
So obviously in 2015, 2016, we'd already had a few years of austerity. So there'd already been quite significant service cuts, bed cuts, and we were noticing that the service was becoming like more pressured, and doctors work really long hours. So we were already working really hard. And you give up quite a lot as a junior doctor as well, because you have to work really antisocial hours and you don't have a lot of choice over the hours and the shifts you work and that kind of thing. So you end up doing things like working Christmas, missing your friend's wedding, you're working all the time. And because you have to move around a lot with the job as well, it can be quite transitory. It can be quite difficult to put down roots where you're working. So it's just a tough job. Right. And you do it because you love it and people are extremely dedicated to the NHS. But doing that and then being attacked at the same time by someone who's essentially insinuating that you're lazy and you're not doing good enough job, and because of you, patients are suffering.
Sorry, when you say somebody's attacking you, do you mean ministerially, or do you mean like people that you're actually treating, that they've been waiting too long? Or?
So at that point, we didn't really, well, I certainly didn't feel that the public were critical. We got a lot of support from the public. It felt like attacks specifically from politicians and some media outlets as well, of which you can probably imagine which ones. Yeah. But I mean, I suppose the reason it was significant for not just myself, but for a lot of doctors, is because doctors prior to prior to that, certainly of my age group, I think we'd all just sort of been chugging along with our heads down, working hard in quite a stretched service, but didn't feel that we were up against the politicians in a sort of combative way. And that situation, which went on for about a year, was really unpleasant. And we came out at the end of it with a contract being imposed on us, which was bad, and much more of an awareness about what's going on in the NHS generally, because I think all of us sort of woke up and became quite political and quite aware of what was going on. And the trajectory since then has got worse and worse. But basically, since then, so I was working as a junior doctor when all that was going on. I then had my two children in quite quick succession. So I had 2 maternity leaves kind of almost back to back. And that gave me a lot of time. And I got quite involved in a few different NHS campaigns because I just was in London and kind of pushing around a pram and used to bring my baby along to like protests and all kinds of stuff. And like, it was just a funny time in my life, I suppose, because I had a bit more headspace to engage in that kind of stuff because I wasn't doing my day job. And doctors who had kind of come together trying to put together sort of grassroots projects around the kind of junior doctor contract started organising in different ways. And there was some really powerful Facebook groups that existed where people were talking about stuff. And I decided to set up a Facebook group for all doctors because up until then it had been very much like the junior doctors grouping up together or consultants grouping up together. So I set up a Facebook group, which we still use, which is called The Political Mess. And it was a sort of play on the idea of the doctor's mess, which is like the staff room for doctors in a hospital.
Okay,
and it's the place goes and they talk about stuff. So anyway, this Facebook groups called The Political Mess, and it quickly grew to about 25,000 members, and there was a couple of very high profile legal cases going on that people kind of used this Facebook group as a way of crowdfunding and talking to one another and supporting one another through quite difficult stuff going on. Anyway, this was all going on and it was taking up a lot of my free time and I was really, really passionate about it. And I started feeling so strongly about what the government were doing to the NHS and how they were treating healthcare workers and what that was doing to patients that I thought that probably what we needed was a non-profit, which would be a sustainable organisation which would hire people to run campaigns so that whenever the media were, throwing attacks at staff or we needed to share information or whatever, we would be able to call upon a team instead of kind of scrabbling around and trying to do media interviews on our lunch break or whatever, which is what we had been doing. So that's where the idea for the organisation I run, Every Doctor, kind of came from. The other bit of it is that it's really difficult for doctors to speak up in the media safely because press departments of their workplaces don't like them to reveal problems that are happening.
Right.
And that's really problematic because, if there's problems that are affecting patients, staff have a duty to speak up and want to speak up quite frequently. And they'll often try to within, their own workplace. And it's not to say anyone's trying to do a bad job, but there's just not enough resource right now. And sometimes they want to talk about the wider system and, their worries about what's going on with a lack of resource and whatever. But press departments really push back on staff speaking up in the media because it's awful. There have been cases where, actually what is a systemic problem, what's going on all over the country, if people speak up in one place, it attracts the attention to that hospital or that workplace and it makes it look like that place is failing.
Right.
And that can attract negative attention to that workplace. It's not, so that's not good.
Yeah, like I get that there has to be an approved channel for messaging and so on. But if it's getting into the territory of life and death and patients being missed or sleeping out in corridors or there isn't enough funding or resources or they're not hiring enough nurses or something, and it's adversely, like there's fatalities that are attributable to it, would they then stop you from talking? Like, how would that work if you wanted to speak out about that kind of stuff?
Well, what normally happens, there's a great deal of worry about speaking up about things like that. And so what we've done since we started Every Doctor, is we've got an encrypted email address where we get people to send stuff in, and we anonymise it and take it to the papers so that the person can't be traced.
Yeah.
But we've broken quite big stories in the press, and then there have been sort of attempted witch hunts to try and find who that person was who broke the story to us, and we've just never revealed who any of these people are. But that sort of thing goes on, and it's horrible, really, because there are occasions, like you say, where patient safety is at risk.
How fucking depressing is that? That, like, so in a country, in a society where you would hope that actually the story is there isn't enough money here, there's not enough resources, we need to up the money that we're putting in to hire in the right resources and correct facilities so that this shit never happens again. But actually the story that that comes out the other end for some people in Fleet Street is like, well, we better fucking hunt down whoever leaked that, you know?
Well, do you know, I don't know if it's people in Fleet Street. I think it's locally that, you know, people within the workplaces will be trying to work out, like, who's the person who revealed this.
But then it's like, isn't that even worse?
Yeah. Oh, it was awful during the pandemic. We got, you know, because people were sharing a lot of information with us, and we were being sent emails that had come to staff from press departments, which were really threatening. You know, if we find out who this person is, then blah, 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 you know, it's awful.
Yeah.
And these were just, you know, felt the need to inform the public about what was going on. Quite often it was just safety stuff, or, you know, concerns about not having enough PPE or whatever, you know, and that information needed to get into the public domain.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's a bit like when, I mean, I'm going to butcher the quote now and I can't remember who I should attribute it to, but isn't it like a riot is the language of the unheard, something along those lines? So it's like where diplomacy breaks down and people are no longer listened to, eventually they will end up rioting. And it's not, obviously it's not that bad, but it's like, you know, if you report these things up the correct channels to procurement or to human resources or whatever, and they just keep pushing back and saying, well, you know, we'd love to keep things safe for you. We wish that we could hire in 10 new doctors to that ward or whatever. But unfortunately, no. Like, eventually they're going to go that route, right? It's the same sort of...
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And during the pandemic, it was ludicrous, to be honest. I mean, there was, for GPs, for example, so a lot of GPs weren't sent enough safe PPE at the beginning of the pandemic because the government hadn't planned things properly and they didn't have enough PPE. And they primarily sent it to intensive care units because, I mean, for safety reasons, because in some procedures that were going on in intensive care units, there was going to be more viral load into the air, blah, blah, blah. So that was a sort of practical consideration on their part. However, it meant that GPs were being sent, you know, if you were in a really big surgery with 50 staff, for example, you might be sent one box of those flimsy masks at the beginning of the pandemic. That was all they were given.
Yeah.
And sent emails, and we were sent these saying things like, we're not going to give you any more PPE. There's no more PPE for you. Can you contact your local hairdresser or school and see if anyone's got like a laser printer or a 3D printer or whatever? And then they'd receive another email that would say, don't go to the press about any of this. You can't tell anyone this is going on. And you're thinking, these people, they're on their own. A lot of them were doing stuff like drive down to B&Q and literally buy whatever they could, like buying Perspex walls and, you know, random masks that they found, you know, all this sort of thing. And it was like, then they can't talk about it. But if they could talk about it, someone might come up with a solution for them.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like you're not solving anything by like muzzling everyone and stopping them from communicating.
Yeah.
So I suppose, so you've got this one challenge on this side that is that messaging is being frustrated and restricted from getting out. Then on the other side, in terms of your campaigning or people like you trying to get the message out in terms of privatisation and lack of funding, you've got this ongoing challenge now, let's say for the last like 3 or 4 years, that there's this, it just feels like there's one massive news story after another. Like it's Brexit, then it's the pandemic, then we got a new prime minister and the Queen's died and now the economy's falling through the floor. Like it feels to me like you have the NHS privatisation funding falling further and further, like off of page 1, off to like page 2, down to the bottom of page 3, like in terms of people's like everyday concerns, where it used to, like, it would have been in the top 3. Is that is that something that you're battling with at the moment, is to try and keep this at the top of the agenda, to make people aware that things are getting worse still?
Yeah, I mean, it's a real tricky one. I was actually looking at some polling the other day, looking at people's priorities at the moment and how it changes. Like, it's always quite interesting to look at, isn't it? And you're right, the NHS at the moment is like number 3 or 4, and it doesn't normally fall out of the top 5.
Right.
But the thing really worrying at the moment for us is, I guess, as doctors, like, I'm not working clinically anymore. I just work for every doctor doing campaigning, but you know, you don't lose your sense of watching an impending disaster and trying to intervene. And something that our network are really, really good at are looking at, you know, the stats of, you know, what's happening now, how pressured are things now, how bad's it going to get? We can predict it pretty well. And right at the beginning of COVID, for example, before it was in the papers, doctors in our forum were, you know, warning each other, this is going to get really bad. Have you seen this? Blah, 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 showing all this information, because we know what's going to happen. So it's September now, to answer your question.
Right.
It's going to get really, really, really bad this winter. And we're trying to warn people now about how bad it's going to get. But you're right, the news cycle is so swamped with all of the other stuff that it's quite difficult raising the alarm about all of this. And what's really frustrating is that the media pounce on these stories in such an intense way when the A&E, like, you know, is so backed up that you can't get in. And, you know, things are really bad now, but like, it will get worse. And I know that I'll get those phone calls in December and January and February. What could have been done, you know, and what can we do? How are we going to start? And I'll be thinking to myself, well, I've been telling you since August and you just haven't.
Yeah.
You know, things could be done now to prevent things getting worse this winter, but it won't be tackled, I don't think.
But then when you say things are going to, like, it's bad and it's going to get really, really, really bad, like, how specific can you be about that?
Okay, so the NHS waiting lists all across the UK, but particularly in England, are the worst they have ever been on record. And every single month now, they're breaking their own records for being the worst they've ever been. So you've got a population of people with a very high clinical need. So a lot of people need to see a specialist now and are not seeing one. That is heaping enormous pressure on GPs, because people who would normally by this point have been seen by a specialist and would be managed by specialist care pathways are under the care of their GP still, who's having to manage a caseload of really clinically complex patients. So all the GPs are under enormous strain. The ambulance waiting times are really, really long. That's because of a complex situation where essentially an ambulance can't leave a hospital car park until they've dropped off their patient, but the patient can't go into A&E until there's room in A&E. And there's people stuck in A&E because there's no beds on the wards. And so there's this kind of like backlog situation going on. So
Right.
ambulance really, really long. So you've got ambulance waiting times really, really long already. Waiting lists are really, really long. And we're missing in England almost 10% of the NHS workforce at the moment. That's really terrible as well. And that's for a combination of reasons, but a lot of people have left the NHS because it's so stressful to work in.
Yeah.
And what happens in the winter months is we've got COVID, which will probably put some pressure on the NHS. That's going to make things worse. Respiratory illnesses always escalate during the winter months. Mm-hmm. So that puts additional pressure on the health service. And, you know, for those months between December and February, we pretty much have a crisis every single year, because the beds have been cut in the NHS to the point that we run at about 92 to 96% capacity beds-wise all year round. Right. So when you have periods of additional pressure, which just happen because that's just human nature and that's the seasonal cycle, every single winter we have a crisis. There was one winter, I think it was 2017, where the Red Cross had to step in and called it a humanitarian crisis.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't be surprised if we ended up in a situation like that this winter again. It's difficult to see how we won't.
Yeah, like nothing's magicking itself. There's no solutions coming down the line. So why
No.
would it be any different, right? I suppose, like, not to use too crude an example, but sometimes when I phone up the bank, right, and I get that sort of voicemail message and it says, like, we are experiencing very high call volumes at the moment, so please bear with us. Your waiting time is, like, 45 minutes or something. And I'll be thinking, this is Monday morning, and that's a pre-recorded message. You must know that this is a busy time, so why don't you hire more staff, right? So there's this sort of arrogance on my part to go, like, Monday morning, super busy time. If you haven't got enough staff, upscale. What's the fucking problem? So if I apply that same sort of arrogance and ignorance to the situation with the NHS, what happens? What is the restriction there? And you can be as blunt and brutal as you like in terms of upscaling, like getting the staff that you need.
Yeah, so we have just launched a campaign with exactly that in mind, because long term we need to have a big staffing plan. So long term they need to be training up more staff, and they need to be trying to retain staff and support the staff so they don't leave, retire early, go abroad, change profession or whatever. That's a long term thing. But in the short term, there are a few things you could do right now to bolster the workforce so that there's more bums on seats, for want of a better analogy. So we've put together this 5-point plan, and it's really basic stuff. It's like, if someone's working an extra shift out of hours, pay them more money, because that will encourage them to do the extra shift. The Home Office have a massive backlog of people administratively that they should be approving their paperwork. It's all taking too long. They need to fast track that, and they need to stop charging doctors and other healthcare workers who've come in such high, like, visa fees and things like that, because that's just a barrier to getting staff working. They need to sort the pensions out. There's this total pensions disaster where senior doctors are not working as many extra shifts as they could because they get penalised with tax. And it's all these things that in the long term, we just need to have a sensible conversation about how many staff we have and train up more. Mm-hmm. But in the short term, the government just essentially need to throw money at the situation and try and get more staff working more hours. Sorry, go.
No, I was just going to say, like, to what extent do you think this comes down to, like, unfortunate optics for a Tory government? Like, you want to go into cabinet meeting and say, you need to give us some more fucking money because this, like, we're sinking over here. And indeed with, like, immigration, like, if you could get more doctors to come over from the US or from wherever, would that be seen as a sort of like an immigration story? Like, we should be training our own more, or is there a level of that to it where there's just not much Tory appetite to help? Or
we have, it kind of depends who's in charge. And I mean, there's been so many cabinet changes over the last few years that, like, there hasn't really been a constant view on that, I wouldn't say. Some people, I think, are more, some of the Conservative politicians are more supportive of the idea of just inviting anyone in and bolstering the workforce. Others, there definitely has been this sense that, we need to get rid of overseas workers, and that's incredibly negative. And it's hard to really dissociate that from the general hostile environment towards immigrants, because, quite frankly, even if you were just looking at this in economical terms, the NHS is really inefficient in some ways at the moment, and if you got more staff in, it would just help it. So I cannot understand why they're making it so difficult for people to come in and offer their skills and experience, even if you didn't like the idea of having workers from other countries coming, like, as a temporary measure, it would fix things. So there is that. And then in terms of giving money, it's a really tricky one with giving the NHS money, because it's been underfunded for a really long time. NHS campaigners such as myself think that that's because of a broader plan to privatise the NHS. And when a pot of funding is given to the NHS as well, because quite a lot of it is wasted on management consultants or things that don't affect change, unless that budget is ring-fenced specifically to hire staff or support staff or give them a pay rise or whatever, it's difficult to know where that money goes, because it's quite opaque at the moment.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah, because I suppose that's the perception for a lot of people, is that it is this like bottomless pit that we just continue to funnel billions into, and the pushback that you always get on panels and various opinion pages is that the NHS is always being, like, the funding is always being increased, and it's always at crisis point every winter. And I don't know enough about the intricacies of it, so I don't know. It's really interesting to hear your take on that.
There's a huge funding gap at the moment, and it's complicated. Basically, healthcare since the NHS has existed has changed enormously. You know, the NHS is 75 years old, so 75 years ago we didn't have very much in the way of effective treatments in lots of areas. There have been so many developments. So the fact that NHS healthcare costs go up every year, no one should be surprised about that. We have a completely different way of treating people. The government actually, in terms of, percentage increase each year, squeezed that so much during the 2010s. If you look at a graph of kind of NHS increases in investment, it's like it's going up and up and up, like steps, and then it gets to the 2010s, it like goes off a cliff. And then during COVID, huge amount of investment was made, but some of it going into projects which didn't really bear much in the way of improvement for the NHS, like the test and trace and that sort of stuff. So at the moment, it looks like loads has been invested into the NHS, and there's certainly this plan that the government are investing more for the next couple of years, and yet a lot of that is now being swallowed up by inflation and energy costs and a pay rise to staff, although the pay rise is tiny, and it seems weird that they haven't planned that into the budget in the first place.
Yeah.
So yeah, the funding is going to go up, and that needs to, but also, sorry, just my final thing, they haven't done a lot of the really basic maintenance on NHS buildings for the last few years. So at the moment in England, there's a £9 billion backlog just on basic repairs, there's water coming in through the roof, really basic stuff that they haven't bothered fixing.
Which is just bizarre, isn't it? It's like I talk about sort of short-termism and long-term mentalities a lot in TikToks and stuff, but like it never ceases to amaze me, this idea that, oh well, look, we could cut the budget for this. Yeah, just don't bother maintaining the building. Yeah, it's fine if it's a bit leaky. Like you might save some money that day or that week or that year, but it's gonna come back to bite you in the arse, and then you have to fucking build a whole new building or something,
Yeah. And some of these repairs, they get graded on kind of how dangerous is this, this situation. And quite a few of them, it's like poses a moderate risk to patients and stuff. It's like, why on earth is that happening in hospital? It just seems ludicrous. But it's all just such big sums of money now. You're right, because a lot of this stuff hasn't been tackled now for years. It just gets big. The longer you leave it, it gets more and more costly to sort it out.
I always imagine that there's like the decision makers in the upper echelons of the Conservative Party, that they know that these things need fixing, but they also know, they've been around long enough that they know that they're not going to be in government forever. So they're like, oh, just let a Labour government fix it. You know what I mean? Like, kick it down the road.
Yeah.
We won't have to deal with it.
Yeah, but I mean, they've been in power so long now, haven't they?
Yeah. I mean, it's either that. Either it's a sort of laissez-faire, like, yeah, let Labour fix it attitude, and actually this brings me on to another question I was going to ask you, or they are just outright sociopaths. They just don't care. Like, if the building falls down, it kills a few hundred patients, fine. You know, it's a few less GP appointments. It's a few, you know, like, could they be that callous, do you think?
Okay, so the labelling with psychiatric like terminology or diagnoses or something, I struggle with that because these people haven't been assessed by any of the people giving them those names.
Right.
So I don't like it when, you know, words like sociopath or psychopath get used, because that's actually a clinical diagnosis for someone who has got a mental health problem. But in terms of callous thinking, I have had so many times in the last few years, I think we probably all have, that you sit there looking at the actions that are being taken, and these people are not stupid, and they're also not ignorant, because they're being informed of the risks that these decisions, the risks inherent in the decisions they're taking. And the decisions are taken anyway, and they're done brazenly. And most of the people making those decisions also are sort of unaccountable to it. Like if it all goes wrong, they sort of just walk away. And during the pandemic, that was really difficult to tolerate, because in real time, you could see decisions being made that weren't keeping people safe. And that's just unbelievable to witness that happening, and for a person to not feel an unbelievable sense of guilt towards the population. I found that really difficult.
These are sort of, I mean, I'm not the psychiatrist between us, but these are traits of someone who has that condition, right? So like a shamelessness, lack of guilt, lack of empathy, risk taking.
Sure. I mean, I don't want to diagnose any politicians with anything, but I think something that can happen is that group mentality can be really toxic. And sometimes I think a group of politicians have lots of power, and they can block out the voices they don't want to hear. And this kind of really awful groupthink can occur where, people sort of reassure each other that something is the right course of action. And then it's almost like, because the decision has been agreed on and you've all backed each other up, you then can't back out, because you've invested this sort of, you've decided, you've invested in a decision. That's it.
I think it's also because I'm perhaps generalizing here a little bit, but I get the feeling that because so many of them, particularly in the Conservative Party, are sort of privately educated, maybe like boarding school kind of upbringings, that there is this feeling of like institutions instead of family. And so the party becomes everything. Do you know what I mean? Like there's camaraderie between them. They all went to Eton together, or Oxbridge or Harrow, or wherever the case may be. And so for them, in their work life, their family life, which members club they go to, everything comes down to backing your mate up who used to wear the same school blazer as you. So when you get into a bit of a pickle and someone says, well, should we just send the PPE up north and we'll just let the people down south not have any? Like when somebody makes a problematic decision like that, you're part of this institution, and it would be a little bit like it might feel a little bit like you were going against your actual family, maybe? Do you think?
Do you think that Westminster itself acts as an institution in that regard?
I think so, yeah. I mean, people talk a lot about the Westminster Bubble. I think if you watch old interviews with David Cameron after he'd left Number 10, he was asked, I think he was asked directly if he regretted announcing the referendum as part of the manifesto. And he even said, he was like, no, I did the right thing for my party. Like, it wasn't the right thing for the country. It wasn't the right thing for the British people. It was the right thing for his party. And I remember being like, wow, that's a really actually quite interesting answer, and really troubling, I think, for anyone that exists in the real world to willingly throw political uncertainty out into it's taking a Tory psychodrama and letting it bleed out into society and breaking up there's like brothers that no longer speak to each other because one's a Brexiter and one's a Remainer, and and now to a greater or lesser extent we are where we are economically because of that decision that he made back in 2015. Was it 2015 election?
Yeah. And the same sort of thing post-pandemic. We're not really post-pandemic, but with Hancock and others talking about their actions and sort of patting each other on the back about how they'd protected the NHS and hadn't they all done a great job. And it's unbelievable to listen to, because we all lived through it. We all knew what happened and how terribly they managed the whole situation. And as a human, it's just difficult to imagine standing up and saying that publicly, because you would think that if you had been in that position, even if you'd managed it terribly and it had all been unprecedented and you hadn't expected any of it and you weren't well prepared, blah, 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 you would hope that even if it was managed terribly, someone could just stand up and say, like, we're really sorry, like, we tried and we didn't do a very good job, and we were going to learn from this.
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, it's weird, isn't it? Because when I went to school, that's what you were taught to say. You weren't taught to stand there and just brazen it out.
Yeah, you're right. And it's an interesting thing to touch on as well, because I've discussed this before with my girlfriend when I've been sort of wearing my my faux psychiatrist cap, I guess, my armchair psychologist or something. And I've sort of said, you know, it always confuses me why people in these positions who seem to crave popularity, and in some cases the limelight, people like Boris Johnson, I'd argue Matt Hancock, not so much Liz Truss, but people who crave the limelight and popularity, and yet they can never admit that they're wrong. And yet, if you do hold your hands up and you say, guys, I really thought I was onto a winner there, and I'm really sorry, but I fucked up, and that's on me. I'm really sorry. Like, there's a likability to being that person. If you can just be a bit humble and accept like the responsibility that comes with your mistake, and that you're going to have to try to do better. Like, people like that individual when they apologize and they acknowledge their shortcomings. So you would think, in the interest of seeking likability, that they would do that, but they don't.
Well, I wonder if it comes back to that Westminster Bubble thing, where any admission of a sort of chink of failure or a chink of not being sure about something allows people to attack you. And so maybe sort of systemically and culturally there, people just do not admit failures because you just become a target. I mean, it's really unhealthy.
But it's also like how can you, I mean, it's one thing to, you know, go to work and have your media training crew say, like, don't give them a fucking inch, because if you acknowledge something, they will never stop. They'll never let up, and it'll be the end of your career. Like, I kind of get that. But isn't there, like, how could you go home to your kids after that and go, yeah, I had a good day, like that? They'll be like, Dad, you lied on TV, Dad. All of my friends are calling you a liar. Like, how could you? I don't know if I could be that person, you know? Yeah.
I know, but maybe it comes back to that party idea. I mean, I don't know. I'm not a political expert in terms of, you know, any of this stuff, but maybe there is that pressure from the party to sort of not let the side down and toe the party line. And certainly this is sort of going off at a tangent slightly, but we were running a campaign at the beginning of the beginning of COVID. It was called Protect NHS Workers, and we were calling for safety measures to be put in place. And sort of we did manage to convince them to do a couple of things, but a lot of Conservative MPs were receiving these emails from us. We were meeting with a big group of MPs every single week, bringing doctors from the front line to tell them what was going on in various things. It was quite important because a lot of MPs weren't getting expert information like the government were. So anyone who wasn't actually a government minister wasn't being given as good sort of intel about what's going on. And we were like giving people this information. So a lot of Conservative MPs just ignored every single one of the emails that were sent to them about all of these meetings, all of the constituents who emailed them. It was unbelievable, really, because it was like, why don't you at least want to hear? Like, why don't you at least want to know what's happening in hospitals? But it was like they just didn't, you know, they weren't going to go there. And I actually really admired the small group of Conservative MPs who did come along or would like call me up. They didn't necessarily agree with the stuff I was pushing for, but like at least we could have a conversation.
Yeah.
But it was authority. It was really bizarre.
But that's the big thing, isn't it, about this new political period that we're in now, where it's not even about debate or an exchange of ideas. It's about tribalism and just binary, like, you wear a blue tie and I wear a red tie, so fuck you. Like, it's just discourse through the toilet, round the U-bend. I'm super conscious of time, Dr. Patterson, so I will just ask you one last question. Let's try and leave it on a light note. We've touched on a few sort of, I guess, slightly depressing topics tonight in terms of where we're at with the NHS politically. We are turning a corner, though, poll-wise, at least, it looks like, and there is a possibility of a Labour government in the not-too-distant future. Do you have hope and faith for the future of Britain and the NHS?
Well, okay, so I'm going to qualify this by saying the organisation I run is sort of non-party political. However, on a personal level, I have been quite open about the fact that I think this particular Conservative government is not good and and would like to get rid of them. The problem, I think, about the alternative at the moment, which is the opposition, which is Labour, is that, what I do is mostly focused on the NHS, and it's quite heavily focused on the kind of the future of the NHS and privatisation. And worryingly, one of the pledges that Keir Starmer got elected into his leadership position with was he said that he would remove private outsourcing from the NHS if he was elected as Prime Minister. And he has recently got rid of that pledge. And it's really concerning because we've been running a project recently mapping out the private outsourcing across the UK. It's heavily in England. There's hardly any in any of the other nations, mostly in England. And a study came out in the Lancet journal recently. I don't want to patronise anyone, but the Lancet is one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world. And this study has come out showing that as you increase the level of outsourced care to private companies, you increase treatable mortality. So people are dying unnecessarily.
Yeah.
When when you move NHS services into the private sector.
And I'm sure that you can correct me on this, but I'm of the mind that the reason that happens is because as soon as you outsource it to somebody, let's say it's Virgin Healthcare, but there's a lot of other providers, I'm sure, they still have to run the same service and treat the same number of patients, but they've got to make a profit now as well. And so what they'll do is start to put cuts in or hire fewer people, and so fewer people get treated, and so then there's a heightened risk. Have I got that broadly right?
So I guess that's what people think. So that there's a full analysis has not been done. I don't think we know for sure. I suspect it's a combination of reasons. That definitely is one of them. Because if you're trying to create a profit from a service, you're going to be looking for efficiency savings. And so you're going to be cutting stuff. But also, I suspect something that is a problem is that every time an NHS service changes hands and you have a change of contract, change of staff, all that logistical stuff, it introduces bureaucracy and a bit of chaos locally, and a lot of resource goes into it. And it breaks down some of the staff-patient relationships because all of that caring relationship, that really matters. So all of this is a little bit difficult to quantify, but I suspect that comes into it as well.
Sure.
I think the privatisation argument, until quite recently, was seen purely in ideological terms. Like, some people loved the NHS because it was publicly funded and publicly run, and that's how they wanted it always to be because they were socialists. And then there were other people who were more sceptical of that because they kind of liked the market and thought that it would generate innovation to introduce market forces, etc., and that would be good because then if services are in competition with each other, they're going to perform better. But actually, in the NHS, I don't think that's the case. I think, within healthcare, it's collaboration that creates innovation, and it's shared information, shared IT, shared technology across the service that makes everyone get better. You don't need like one little service being amazing and better than the one in the next door town. That actually doesn't benefit anybody.
Yeah.
So anyway, so in terms of what I think going forward, I'm worried that Labour are going to continue this trajectory towards privatisation, which is horrendous because patients are going to suffer as a result.
Yeah, I've heard a lot about Starmer and not just around healthcare, but other pledges also, where he said the right thing to get the leadership. Now he's in a leadership role and slowly winding these things back. And so there's a lot of feeling of, can I trust this person? I sort of look at it, call it naive if you like, but I look at it like anything has to be better than having the Tories in with the last 12 years. And then if he doesn't perform in the way that we need him to in that role, form lobby groups and put pressure on. And you're more likely to get your questions answered in a Labour government, even if it is somebody like Starmer who has this reputation for perhaps relaxing some of his pledges, I think you're more likely to get an answer to the questions with the Labour government than you are with the Tories continuing. So it's sort of, I don't know, I'm kind of, maybe I'm burying my head in the sand a bit.
No, you're right. It is super uncomfortable even to have this conversation, really, isn't it? Because there are some other pledges that, have been spoken about in the last couple of days at the Labour conference, which are really great. And, my focus mainly is on health, but there's obviously in my personal life other things I'm really worried about, like climate crisis and all kinds of, and I think we got to have a global view on it all. And I don't like this word very much, but maybe we need to be pragmatic and think, we're voting towards it doesn't have to be perfect, right? We don't have to be voting for perfection. We have to be voting for the next step towards what we.
Yeah, and that's a nice positive note to leave us on. It's it doesn't have to be perfect, but just something broadly resembling happiness is fine.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for joining me tonight, Dr. Patterson. If you would like to follow my guest, Dr. Julia Patterson, on Twitter, she's on @JU Julia Grace on Twitter. Is there any other platforms that you want to promote? I suppose Every Doctor has
Every Doctor UK. That's the organisation that I run.
Cool. Jump on there, guys, and support if you are in a position to. I'll be back next Wednesday with a solo show of the podcast. If you would like early access to the shows, consider jumping on the Patreon. As ever, if you're not in a position to support the podcast, that's fine too. I totally understand that. It's a weird fucking time for everyone at the moment. All I would say is that if you are enjoying, say, 2 or 3 episodes, maybe share me around like the cheap tart that I am. Press the upwards arrow on one of the episodes that you found, I don't know, enlightening or funny or whatever, and then pop it into WhatsApp to a friend of yours or an enemy, I don't care, and just say, every listen counts. And just say, I've been listening to this guy, he talks a bit about politics, and I think you might like him, or hate him, whatever. I will be back, as I say, next Wednesday. I'll be back next Friday with another guested show. Thank you once again to my guest tonight, Dr. Julia Patterson. We outie.